Dutch. Not working. Right, okay. The Dutch colony and its rivals. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to set foot on the southernmost tip of Africa, giving to it the name of the Cape of Good Hope, which they discovered as early as 1488. Nevertheless, it was the Dutch who established the Cape Colony in 1652. March 1647, a Dutch ship en route for Asia had been shipwrecked off the Cape. The ship's crew built a small fort there and stayed for nearly a year until they were finally rescued by a Dutch fleet of 12 ships. After their return to Holland, some of the ship's complement sought to persuade the Dutch East India Company to open a trading center at the Cape. The Dutch East India Company had been established in 1602 for trading with the Mughal Empire in India. The Cape would provide a useful trading post, supplying the company's ships with fresh food and water, and their men with a chance to rest. On Christmas Eve, 1651, accompanied by his wife and son, Jan van Riebeck set out from the Netherlands for the Cape of Good Hope to oversee the setting up of this refreshment center. His 5 ships landed on the 6th of April, 1652, with 90 Calvinist settlers in the bay of today's Cape Town, and established the first permanent European settlement. They found that the area was already inhabited by the Khoikhoi people, who were hunter-gatherers and cow herders. They began to trade with them, introducing them to brandy and tobacco. Two very excellent European imports to start with, in return for fresh meat. Very soon after their arrival, war broke out between the two communities, while the indigenous population was seriously reduced through the diseases brought by the Europeans. As the Dutch and other European settlers moved inland, the Khoikhoi vanished by the end of the 18th century, partly due to a lack of grazing pasture land caused by expropriation. The Dutch in southern Africa were a farming people, and thus became known as Boers, meaning farmers, and developed a language derivative and yet distinct from that in the Netherlands, known as Afrikaans, so that they would eventually become known as Afrikaners. The land to the north became increasingly infertile, in conflict with increasingly infertile in the desert, so they expanded eastwards. In doing so, they found themselves in conflict with a much more intimidating people than the Khoikhoi, the Xhosa. They were altogether more sophisticated and more centralized in their political and military structures. The Xhosa attacked the vulnerable and isolated homesteads and farms of the Boers. In order to combat these war bands, the Boers began to form small defensive units, the commandos, more of which there will be later, that were much later to be used into such great effect against the British. The arrival of the British, short section. The British themselves came into the equation as a result of Britain's long and protracted wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. In 1795, the Netherlands surrendered to the invading French armies and changed sides. Therefore, the weak Dutch colony at the Cape became strategically dangerous to British shipping and trade. A British army under General Sir James Henry Craig set out for Cape Town in order to secure the colony. The governor of Cape Town refused at first to cooperate, but after the British threatened to use force, he capitulated. He did so all the more readily due to the fact that the indigenous peoples eagerly deserted their former masters and flocked to the British. The British would leave it in 1803 as a result of the general truce negotiated at the Treaty of Amiens, and the Cape reverted temporarily to the Dutch for the last time. After the resumption of hostilities, the Dutch ceded the colony back to the British, and British sovereignty was formalized at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Shaka and the Zulu Empire. Meanwhile, both Boers and British faced a serious new threat from the Zulu nation's greatest and most fearsome warlord, the young and new king, Shaka. The Zulus had been one of many small tribes in the region. In the 18th century, there had been no more than about 1,500, occupying a mere 10 square miles or thereabouts. By the time that Shaka was assassinated in 1828, they numbered around 250,000. Their core territory comprised of an area about the size of Wales, with client chiefdoms up to twice that size. Shaka established a new, much bigger royal household, or kraal, at Kwa Bulawayo, now Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. His forces rapidly expanded his empire along Africa's southeastern coast, and more dangerously, inwards. Shaka did so by uniting the surrounding warring chiefdoms into a new kingdom under himself, through the ruthless slaughter of all those who dared to oppose him. Some estimate that during his reign, Shaka caused the death. It was only a 12-year reign, I think. Shaka caused the death of more than 1 million people, while his wars between 1818 and 1828 also contributed to a series of forced migrations. The British were also expanding the Cape Colony, and in doing so, northwards and eastwards towards Shaka's kingdom. Britain now held more territory, but the Zulus vastly outnumbered them and all the other Europeans. And the colonists felt increasingly nervous, insecure, and vulnerable. Shaka was deposed and assassinated after little more than a decade. His kingdom then went into decline. By the 1840s, the colony had acquired both Basotho land and Natal, reaching the east coast and bordering Zululand to its south and southwest. David Livingstone expressed a widespread opinion of the Zulus in his journal published in 1857. The Zulus are tall, muscular, and well-made. They are shrewd, energetic, and brave. Altogether, they merit the character given them by military authorities and by being magnificent savages. Their splendid physical development and form of skull show that, but for the black skin and woolly hair, they would take their rank among the foremost Europeans. End of quotation. The Great Trek. A new cause of friction between the British and the Boers resulted from the abolition of the slave trade within the British Empire in 1807. This made it illegal for British ships to carry slaves or for British colonies to import them. For the meantime, slavery itself continued. The Boer way of life was dependent on African slaves, whom they regarded as most definitely inferior beings. When the British Parliament enacted the abolition of slavery itself in 1833, the Boers were indignant and decided that it was time to establish their own independent republics. No fewer than 7,000 Boers, including women and children, emigrated from Cape Colony into the Great Plains beyond the Orange River and finally reach the northern part of the Transvaal. They went down in the history of the Afrikaners as the Voortrekkers. Piet Retief, the ablest of their leaders, the leaders of the Exodus, on the eve of leaving the colony, published a declaration which you can now read at Grahamstown, dated the 22nd of January, 1837, in which he declared their chief reasons for leaving. I'll give you a moment or two to read that. The Transvaal region is known to have been inhabited since the 8th century by the Venda and Soto peoples. In 1817, the region was invaded by tribes pushed from their land by the Zulu king Shaka and his impis. The Voortrekkers quickly displaced them and established settlements in Natal and in the high veld north of the Orange River, and beyond that, across the Vaal, hence Transvaal. On the 17th of January, 1852, the United Kingdom signed the Sand River Convention Treaty with the Boer territories, recognizing their independence in the region to the north of the Vaal River in the Transvaal. The Orange Free State, a sister Boer republic, was granted independence around the same time. In 1856, the Boers of the Transvaal adopted the name the South African Republic for the region, and the new constitution was put in place. Now the Zulu War, and these are into longer sections now. In 1843, the British annexed Natal and made a treaty with the Zulu king Mpande. He ceded to them the territory south of the Tugela River, a region of which they and the remaining Boer trekkers were already in possession. Good relations survived the War of Succession in 1856 between the two sons of Mpande. The winner was Cetshwayo, who captured and killed his brother. Thereupon, the British Secretary for Native Affairs in Natal, Theophilus Shepstone, confirmed Britain's approval of Shepstone as the heir to the throne. In 1873, Shepstone insisted in the proclamation of him as the king of Zululand after the death of his father in the previous year. The Zulu frontierman Natal was a clear one along with the Tukela River, but Cetewayo was involved in frequent border disputes with the Boers of the Transvaal to the northwest. Shepstone consistently supported the Zulu claim in these disputes until, in 1877, with a colonial officer, he formally annexed the Transvaal for Britain. The Zulu border disputes were now with Shepstone, who suddenly viewed them differently. The new situation was soon to lead to the Zulu War. Disraeli's Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Carnarvon, wanted to consolidate and extend British influence and sovereignty in Southern Africa, and decided to create a federation of the colonies with the Boer republics. Sir Bartle Frere was appointed British High Commissioner in order to fulfill that objective. The first stage of that was to bring Zululand under control, as it bordered with Natal and the Transvaal. Not surprisingly, the Zulu king refused Frere's demands for federation, or to disband the Zulu army, as that would mean relinquishing his power and independence. Hostilities began in January 1872, when a force led by Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford invaded Zululand to enforce British demands. Chelmsford made the mistake of dividing his forces, while most of his advanced column encamped at Isandlwana. On the morning of the 22nd of January 1879, there worked a surprise attack from the main Zulu force, which inflicted upon them the greatest military disaster of the whole of pre-Victoria's reign. Out of a total encampment of 1,700, 52 British officers, 806 rank and file soldiers, and 471 African troops lay dead, a total in excess of 1,300. The battle remains the worst defeat ever inflicted by a native African force on a British army. This slide comes from a fascinating book that I've got. It was a scrapbook of a major general in military intelligence, in fact, in the Edwardian period later, but he kept this scrapbook from the 1870s onwards. So this is a copy of the report I'm about to mention. Chelmsford's report appeared in the London Gazette 5 days later. He explained his absence and that at the time he was informed of enemy movements. He had not felt any anxiety about the safety of the camp, but rather had proceeded with Colonel Glynn to fix upon a site for a new camp. Meanwhile, back at the camp, the whole Zulu force surrounded them. They were overpowered by numbers, and the camp was lost. The effect of this disaster throughout the colony has already shown itself, and the European colonists generally are in great alarm. The country is far more difficult than I had been led to expect, and the labor of advancing with a long train of wagons is enormous. Chelmsford felt obliged to ask for substantial and specific requirements. Churchwire's reserve force of around 4,000 had attacked the supply depot station that evening, stationed in the former mission station of Rockstrift, the evening of the same day as their successful assault on Isandlwana. The valiant and heroic defense of these few beleaguered troops resulted in the Zulus abandoning the attack. Not surprisingly, the Queen and the British public preferred to concentrate on this than on the events of the morning. More VCs, I think 11, were awarded for it than for any other single engagement. Over 80 years later, it became the subject of a famous and much-loved film, Zulu. This led Chelmsford's right column dangerously exposed, and after an initial victory, it encamped at a shower where it was soon cut off from Chelmsford's army, which had retreated back into Natal to await reinforcements. Colonel Pearson and his officers decided to hold out until relieved. Colonel Adrian Wood's left column established a fortification at Kambula as the only effective British force left in Zululand. Wood repelled a Zulu force of 20,000 on the 29th of March and routed them with his cavalry. Meanwhile, reinforcements poured into Natal until Chelmsford felt strong enough to go back into the offensive and invade with 3 columns. He relieved the shower on the 5th of April. On the 4th of July, Chelmsford's 5,000-strong army repelled another attack near Cheswire's main kraal at Alundi. Chelmsford had prepared his position well, with a large defensive square of wagons armed with Gatling guns, early forms of machine guns, and artillery. The cavalry then went into pursuit, and by the end of the battle, around 6,000 Zulus had been slain, for the loss of 10 men killed and 87 wounded. Cheshwire's main kraal was burnt to the ground. Effectively, the war was over, and soon afterwards, the Zulu king was captured and sent into exile in Cape Town. Zululand was now divided up into autonomous areas, and civil war erupted. The British decided to restore Cheshwire in 1883, but he was killed by a rival claimant the following year. In 1887, Zululand was declared to be British territory and annexed to Natal on the 31st of December, 1897, coincidentally 2 days after my own father's birth. The First Boer War. In 1877, after the Transvaal faced considerable economic hardship and external Zulu threats, Theophilus Shepstone annexed the Transvaal from Britain, hoping that this move would be perceived by the Boers as their salvation. The Boers viewed it as an act, on the contrary, as an act of aggression, and protested. The result of the general election of 1880 brought back Gladstone into power. His government declared their intention to uphold British sovereignty in the Transvaal, and therefore the Boers rebelled and resolved to regain their independence by force of arms. The South African Republic proclaimed its independence on the 16th of December, 1880, and so began what they call the Afrikaners call the First War of Independence, or the First Boer War, Anglo-Boer War. Boer commandos laid siege to the British garrison in an attempt to starve them into submission. General Sir George Pomeroy Colley, with 1,400 men, advanced against the Boers. British Commandant General Pete Joubert decided to counter the attack. The British were driven back with heavy losses. Colley also lost 46% of his 400 men at the Battle of Majuba Hill on the 27th of February 1881, while the Boers lost only one man and with 6 wounded. In the Pretoria Convention that August, Boer autonomy was granted, this is important for later, under British overall sovereignty. But the London Convention of 1884 confirmed full internal independence on the Transvaal. But something was to change all that. Diamonds. Eureka. Right. Okay. Sorry, that was the title underneath. What changed the whole situation in Southern Africa was the discovery of both diamonds and gold. More about gold later. In 1866, the first authenticated discovery of a diamond on the African continent took place when Erasmus Jacobs, or Jacobs, found the Eureka, 21.25 carats of rough diamond there on the banks of the Orange River. But it was the discovery there of the Star of Africa, 83.5 carats rough, in 1865, that fired the imagination, became the catalyst for the great diamond rush. From 1869, fortune seekers from all over the world, some of them, of course, coming from California, all over the world, converged on the wet diggings along the banks of the Orange and Vaal rivers. Other major finds over the next few months led to a new rush to a cluster of deposits around what is now the city of Kimberley, unless they've changed the name, in South Africa's Northern Cape province. In 1871, the brothers Johannes Nicholas and Diederich Arnoldus de Beer sold their farm, which was to be the site of both the De Beer mine and the Kimberley mine, into Cecil John Rhodes. Cecil John Rhodes was born on the 5th of July, 1857, in the small hamlet of Bishop Stortford. He was the 5th son of the Reverend Francis William Rhodes and his second wife, Louisa Peacock, or née Peacock. His father was the vicar there, from 1849 until his death in 1876. But his house was a small semi-detached one, which is now the Rhodes Museum. As Cecil suffered from ill health from an early age, he was educated at home rather than sent to a public school like his brothers. He was then sent to Southern Africa, needing a warmer climate because of the problems with his lungs. Rhodes tried unsuccessfully to grow cotton in Natal. At 18, in October 1871, Rhodes left the Natal colony to work alongside his older brother, Herbert, who was looking for diamonds, and therefore arrived at Kimberley. He began to make a fortune there and returned to England in 1873 to study at Oriel College, Oxford. During his first term there, he suffered his first heart attack. That's one bust in Oxford or something they haven't protested about, as far as I'm aware yet. in King Edward Street, the place where he had his flat, his residence. Rhodes overheard a discussion between the doctor and the specialist while he was at his residence in King Edward Street, who gave him 6 months to live. For the rest of his life, he felt that he was on borrowed time, awaiting the inevitable time bomb, and consequently always in a rush to achieve his ambitions. Sorry, that was supposed to be earlier. That's a photograph of Oriel College. I'll just let you have a look at that. I got those in the wrong order. I apologize. While at Oxford, he willingly attended the lectures of John Ruskin. Although he had missed Ruskin's inaugural lecture by over 3 years, its words were still ringing in the ears of undergraduates and left a profound influence on Rhodes. It's where, incidentally, the television series Rhodes is mistaken. He wasn't there in the audience, because he didn't come to Oxford for 3 years later. John Ruskin had addressed an enthralled audience, but crammed into the Sheldonian Theatre on his 51st birthday, the 8th of February, 1870, to hear his inaugural lecture as a Slade Professor of Fine Art. I quote, this is an extract of a long passage about the importance of colonies and of taking advantage, in fact, the duty of Englishmen to civilize the globe. I'm not sure how that fits in with a lecture on fine art, but there we are. Inaugural lectures are usually quite open to all kinds of things. There is a destiny now possible to us, the highest ever set before a nation to be accepted or refused. And this is what she must either do or perish. She must found colonies as fast and as far as she is able, formed of her most energetic and worthiest men, seizing every piece of fruitful waste ground she can set her foot on, and there teaching these her colonists that their chief virtue is to be fidelity to their country, and that their first aim is to advance the power of England by land and sea. Rhodes returned to Kimberley and made himself a fortune, being instrumental in amalgamating the major mining interests of Kimberley into one organization, De Beers Mining Company, which he finally established under his own control, but with a junior partner named Charles Donnell Rudd in April 1880. A primary aim of this company being an attempt to regulate the mining and sale of diamonds. Given the profusion of diamonds at Kimberley, Rhodes considered that unless care were taken, the market could be flooded, bringing down prices. Rhodes finally took his degree in 1881, and in that same year gained one of the newly established parliamentary seats at Berkeley West near Kimberley that he was to hold for the remainder of his life in the Cape Parliament. He now directed his irrepressible energy towards his ultimate dream: to paint the map red, that is, say, British, from Cape to Cairo. This project was fully in line with what he called his confession of faith, which he had first written down in Oxford on the 2nd of June, 1877, and later amended and enlarged back at Kimberley. I wonder if you could possibly read that yourself and give my voice a rest. I could be theatrical about it, but I think perhaps you could read it. Can you all see it? If not, I could read it, but oh, okay, let me do it. I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence. Look again at the extra employment a new country added to our dominions gives. I contend that every acre added to our territory means in the future birth to some more of the English race, who otherwise would not be brought into existence. Added to this, the absorption of the greater portion of the world under our rules simply means the end of all wars. Why should we not form a secret society with one object? He had incidentally been a member of the Masons, but he soon got rather disillusioned with them, so he thought he'd find his own. The furtherance of the British Empire and the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule. For the recovery of the United States. Maybe I should emphasize that phrase. For the making of the Anglo-Saxon race, but one empire. What a dream. And yet it is probable. It is possible. We know the size of the world. We know the total extent. Africa is still lying ready for us. It is our duty to take it. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory. And we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, most human, most honorable race the world possesses. That make quite clear, I am quoting that before anybody accuses me of something I'm not personally postulating. Rhodesia. Rhodes's interest in expansionism led to his appointment in 1884 as resident deputy commissioner in Bechuanaland, Botswana, a territory to the north that Rhodes hoped to see attached to Cape Colony. Rhodes had won mining rights from the Matabele king Lobengula, whose dominion lay to the north of Bechuanaland. The Matabele had previously invaded Mashonaland and subjugated the pastoral Mashona. In 1889, Cecil Rhodes formed the British South African Company and obtained a royal charter from the British government to occupy Mashonaland. He found the place barren of both gold and diamonds, and the company being financially bled through the invasion and occupation. In 1890, he took office as Prime Minister of the Cape, which had achieved self-government in 1872. Rhodes now used his office to establish a British outpost of Fort Salisbury, named after the British Prime Minister, deep in Mashonaland. He then set about provoking Lobengula into war, thereby providing an excuse to invade Matabele land itself. By 1894, Mashonaland and the neighboring Matabele land had been conquered and Lobengula had been defeated and was dead. The two territories were united under the name Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Rhodes was intensely proud to be the only man with a new country named after him. He was by now reputedly the richest man in the world. And what was to change relations with the Boers? Also, it was gold. The discovery of gold in the Transvaal in ever-increasing quantity changed the political geography of southern Africa. A number of insignificant gold deposits were discovered in the northern parts of South Africa between 1840 and 1870. The first gold rush in South Africa took place in 1873. After the first Anglo-Boer War, the newly autonomous republic's government instituted a policy of granting concessions to individuals and companies in an effort to stimulate economic and industrial growth. It soon became apparent how rich in gold deposits the Transvaal really was, as the backward agrarian economy of the area was rapidly transformed into one of the world's major gold markets. One of the biggest ones outside Russia, of course. The Uitlanders. By 1895, having successfully created Rhodesia, Cecil Rhodes had clear designs on the Transvaal. He sought to exploit the grievances of the predominantly British Uitlander foreigner, like the word Auslander in Germany, German Outlander community in Pretoria. These had come into the Transvaal primarily to dig for gold and to make money in the gold fields of the Transvaal. They now outnumbered the Boers. Paul Kruger had adamantly refused to grant the franchise for the Republic's Parliament, the Volksraad, on an equal basis with the Afrikaners. Meanwhile, he taxed them to the hilt. Rhodes and the Jameson Raid. Cecil Rhodes now focused his attention on the stubbornly independent Boer states of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. He sought in vain to bring them into confederation, and when the president of the Transvaal, Kruger, refused, Rhodes looked for a pretext for war once again and indulged in a preemptive strike through the foolhardy and embarrassingly disastrous Jameson Raid. Rhodes made plans for an uprising of Uitlanders in Johannesburg to coincide with the invasion of the Transvaal from Bechuanaland, Botswana, by Rhodes' right-hand man, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson. The Jameson Raid, which began on the 29th of December, 1895, was a total failure and degenerated quickly into a farce. The Uitlander leaders in Johannesburg did not rise. Jameson's troops tried to cut communication lines to Pretoria, but cut the wrong lines. So the Transvaal government knew the raiders were on their way and their troops were waiting. Jameson was seriously outnumbered and outgunned and had to surrender. Rhodes was forced to resign as the premier of the Cape Colony. Even some of his closest friends and allies now began to seriously think that Rhodes had lost his touch and finally had thrown caution to the wind. Meanwhile, the raid led to the Orange Free State cooperating more closely with the Transvaal. The Transvaal and Orange Free State formed together into the South African Republic with an area of 475,000 square miles. They included a rather narrow coastal strip, the high escarpment of the Drakensberg Mountains, and the high upland plateau known as the High Veld. Yes, even I sometimes have to resort to Wikipedia, I'm afraid. At the time, the total population of South Africa, I hope these figures agree with the figures I've got here. I hadn't even checked them. Anyway, we'll see, because I've got them from another source. The total population of South Africa was just over 5 million. 100,000 Indians lived in Natal. 300,000 people of mixed blood, known as coloreds, dwelt mainly in Cape Colony. The largest ethnic group were the African tribes, known collectively as Kaffirs, and amounting to about 3.5 million. The total white population was 1,100,000, which divided almost equally between the British and the Boers, the latter comprising of Dutch and French Huguenot descent. Joseph Chamberlain. Joseph Chamberlain had been appointed colonial secretary by Lord Salisbury, who returned to power after the general election of 1895. He joined forces with Rhodes and tried to develop and promote the British Empire in South Africa. Chamberlain sent Sir Alfred Milner, another loyal supporter of British expansion and a staunch imperialist, to South Africa as British High Commissioner. Milner hoped vainly that Kruger would not be re-elected in 1898. He was. Milner was afraid that the Boer republics wanted to take over the whole country and told Chamberlain that war was the only way to prevent that from happening. 16. The causes of the Second Boer or Anglo-Boer War. On the 9th of October 1899, the two Boer republics issued an ultimatum to Britain, and the Second Anglo-Boer War broke out 2 days later. That's from my grandfather's First Times Atlas of 1895. A number of interrelated factors led to the Second Anglo-Boer War. The God-fearing Boers believed instinctively and religiously in the righteousness of their cause and in their God-given right to the land, coupled with a Calvinistic sense of their own particular divine election. Many British agreed with Rhodes in their devotion to the cause of the British Empire and its civilizing mission. Both sides were almost equally contemptuous of each other. The Uitlanders maintained that they were victims of an unjust discrimination over the rate of taxation and their disenfranchisement. Finally, another final cause was that among others, a deep distrust and personal antagonism that developed very rapidly between Sir Alfred Milner and President Paul Kruger. The final section, which is by far the longest, I think, on the Second Boer War. There'll be a little bit of family history in the middle of this, but we'll come to that in a moment. No, Lisa will be pleased. On my father's side, the first phase of the war was one of the set pieces, well, on both sides actually. The first phase of the war was one of set pieces battles. But from July 1900 onwards, the Boers changed tactics and they conducted a very effective guerrilla war that kept nearly 500,000 British troops occupied until 1902. It was the bloodiest, longest, and most expensive war Britain engaged in between 1815 and 1914. It cost Britain more than £200 million and more than 22,000 soldiers. The Boers lost over 34,000 people and over 15,000 Black Africans were killed. Many civilians were included in those last two figures, including women and children. In the initial Boer offensive, the primary objective was to isolate or wipe out the British forces at Dundee and Ladysmith in Natal, as well as at Mafeking and Kimberley before the British reinforcements arrived. There were blunders and missed opportunities on both sides. However, the situation was worse for the British, as their forces were forced onto the defensive and were besieged with civilians in Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking. After the first reinforcements arrived under General Sir Redvers Buller, he not only failed dismally to relieve Ladysmith, but suffered a disastrous defeat at Colenso. Meanwhile, Methuen sought to advance to Kimberley as quickly as possible. The presence of Cecil Rhodes among the civilians there gave it a high profile. On Marcus Fontaine, Methuen's unsuspecting British troops with the Highland Brigade at the lead walked straight into the deadly fire from the Boer trenches. Here the Boers suffered some 225 casualties, while the British lost 971 men. The war was definitely not going well. 3 British reverses at Stormberg, 10th of December 1899, Marcus Fontaine the following day, and Colenso 3 days later, became known as Black Week. On the 24th of January 1900, a British column of 2,000 men under Major General Woodgate was pinned down by the Boers on the summit of Spiernkopf. The British lost 225 men, 122 were missing, 455 were wounded, and 178 were captured. Only 50 Boers were killed and 140 wounded. In all three attempts to relieve Ladysmith failed. Roberts. The new commander-in-chief, Lord Roberts, and his chief, Major General Lord Kitchener, more of him later, landed in South Africa on the 10th of January 1900. Buller remained in command in charge in Natal. Roberts decided to conquer the Boer republics from the Cape Colony in keeping with their original strategy. Roberts decided to use the Western railway lines for his advance and saw the relief of Kimberley as his prime objective. After achieving this, he would then leave the railway line and make an eastward attack on Bloemfontein, and then advance to Pretoria. From January 1900, he gathered his force of 5,000 men, 50,000 men for the coming campaign. The tide turned. After a quick march, General French, his commander-in-chief in the First War, entered Kimberley on the 15th of February 1900. A fortnight later, Ladysmith was relieved. On the 13th of March, Roberts occupied Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, without meeting any resistance. Baden-Powell, that's how you pronounce the name, by the way, as a member of the family assured me of that. Baden-Powell held out at Mafeking until relieved by Colonels Mahon and Plumer on the 17th of May 1900. The British everywhere went mad with jubilation, and huge crowds celebrated in London on Mafeking night. A slight digression for one paragraph. My wife's first Christmas in England was in 1984, when she came with my father and I to dinner with my mother's older sister, born in 1891. Auntie Hilda leant over to my father and exclaimed, "Bunny, you remember Mafeking night?" My father was only 2 at the time, but what he did remember was the fashion for very young children to wear badges of generals. His had been a Buller, whom he pointed out had already been disgraced. My mother's first husband, born in 1882, had gone out to South Africa with some schoolfellows in a rather strange outfit known as the Eton College Territorial Volunteer Reserve, I think at the age of 17. Whether they actually did anything other than playing cricket or polo, I don't know. The British were now confident that victory was in their grasp, but it proved quickly a misplaced overconfidence. The Boer commandos now resorted to fighting the war on their own terms and proved it to be very skillful at guerrilla warfare. They sought to destroy the British lines of communication, assaulting and destroying railway depots, bridges. They also regrouped their forces in small mobile units that lived off the land. They achieved remarkable success in evading capture, seizing British supplies and disrupting railway communications. 135 train wrecking incidents were recorded between December 1900 and September 1901. Now someone whose great nephew taught me. Roberts had returned to England, leaving Kitchener to oversee the final victory. Kitchener now decided to exhaust the Boers by burning down the lonely farmsteads which sustained them, introducing a so-called scorched earth policy. Women and children, both black and white, were placed in concentration camps. He also built a formidable line of blockhouses, which I think Neil will probably confirm there are several of these, still the relics of these around the place, that bisected the countryside and started flushing out the guerrillas in a series of systematic drives, with success defined in a weekly bag of killed, wounded, and captured. There were more than 40 camps housing 116,000 white men, women, and children, with another 60 camps housing 115,000 blacks. Incidentally, it should be pointed out that both sides had at least theoretically, but there was an understanding on both sides that this was a war between the Europeans or between whites, and that the blacks were not to be brought into it, but they were. These camps were overcrowded, the captives underfed, and the conditions poor. There were limited medical supplies and staff. Diseases like measles, whooping cough, and typhoid fever, diphtheria, and dysentery, which of course killed an awful lot of British soldiers as well, resulted in 1 in every 5 children. 26,370 white women and children died in the concentration camps. 81% of the casualties were children. Statistics were not properly recorded in the Black African camps. The official figure was 14,154 deaths, but the actual total could be more than 20,000, like 20,000. This ruthless, inhumane, but systematically thorough approach finally paid off and brought the poor Boers to the negotiating table. On the 31st of May, the two parties signed the Treaty of Vereeniging at Melrose House in Pretoria. The Boer representatives agreed to surrender their independence and to recognize the authority of Edward VII, the new king, in return for several conditions, which I won't go into, but including a promise of eventual self-government, an agreement that no decision would be taken regarding the franchise of the black population until then. Cecil Rhodes died before the war ended, not living to see the partial fulfillment of his dream in the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1908, which took its place among the so-called white dominions and deferred the issue of black enfranchisement, not finally realized until 1994. Thank you very much.